Now, Ed, you've chosen as your book Niall Ferguson's Ascent of Money. We've got a book here which is a sort of primer on economic history. It tells you how the Medicis and the Rothschilds are every bit as important in our history as the Tudors and the Stuarts, say. Does it shed any light, though, on our present discontents?
Well, it's essential credit crunch reading. Niall Ferguson is, you know, as everybody watching this programme probably knows, well-known telly-historian, part of the kind of duopoly of Andrew Roberts and Niall Ferguson, or perhaps triumvirate with Simon Sharma. And in fact, this does accompany a major television series, this book. But it's a very good kind of introduction to money and the history of money. And I think it's important, first of all, bizarrely, I don't know whether reassuring is the right word, but it reminds you that we've done this before on numerous times through every century, essentially since modern banking was invented, broadly speaking, in Italy in the 14th century onwards. We've had bubbles, speculators, greed, corruption, fraud, which bring the financial system crashing to a halt and people lose their shirts. So in that sense, it's good reading in the sense that it puts things in context and reminds us that there will be, one hopes, life after the credit crunch. And it's also, I mean, Niall Ferguson claims that he foretold the credit crunch some 2 years ago. So in that sense, again, the message in the book, which is not surprising from a historian, is that, you know, if you can learn from history, and a study of history is essential for modern policymakers and people in the financial industry. And I think it's a very, very accessible book. I mean, you don't need to know anything or understand the financial system particularly to enjoy it. Again, rather like when I was praising Barack Obama's book, I mean, what Ferguson does well and what good historians do well is, you know, they bring it down to the level of ordinary people and anecdotes. So they will bring alive the scene in Holland in the 16th century as the stock exchange gets going, or as the Medicis get going in the 15th century in Florence. And so in that sense, it's by no means a dry economics textbook. I think I only got lost on 1 or 2 pages.
Because the world of money is still a bit of a secret world, and those who are outside it can't really understand all these mysterious goings-on that everybody assures them are very significant. What did you make of them?
Well, I think that's right, and particularly at the current moment. I mean, it's interesting you say that thing about history, because one wonders why, you know, it's an obvious thing, why don't we learn from history? And it's also quite recent history as well. It's not as if you have to go back to the 15th century. So it's always a bit of a puzzle to me as to why people, and particularly policymakers and politicians who should know better, don't learn from history. But I think that thing of money, especially at the moment, is quite interesting. My son said to me the other day, he said, well, money, Mum, it doesn't actually exist, does it? I mean, there isn't anything. There's nothing there. It's all kind of notional. And so any attempt to try and explain that and make it feel and help people to understand what the system is about is laudable, I think.
Lola's son is onto something there. Smart. Watch that boy. Yeah, but stop him being a banker. Because really the history of money is about the creation of credit, and that's where Ed's Italians come in, the Medici and the other bankers. Banco means a table. They sat in the marketplace. I didn't know this until I read Niall Ferguson's book. They sat in the marketplace with making their deals, and that enables you to create credit, and that then it goes on and it overdoes it. We've just overdone it, as we all know. On the other hand, a lot of people were able to do a lot of things because of the enormous expansion of credit. So as usual, there's an upside and a downside, and Ed Vaizey's right. We'll get through this one. The thing which stopped me in my tracks was talking about in the days when money was only based on the amount of gold you had, gold or silver. And the Crusades, he says, with the barbarians from the north invading the sophisticated countries of the Middle East, was that we were partly looking for gold and silver because Western Europe in the Middle Ages didn't have any gold and silver mines, didn't have enough money. You don't have enough liquidity, you can't
but that's also
mortgages
the point,
or buy television sets or whatever medieval people did.
You get stuck in this system, and one of the points he makes is that, as it were, Spain got left behind because Spain had access to enormous amounts of gold in South America, so all this pure gold was being hauled over. And therefore, they didn't need this kind of system of credit.
It didn't need proper banking. It ruined them. And he makes an explicit comparison. He says the silver which Spain had ruined it in the same way that oil ruins countries which don't have a proper infrastructure now. It's a curse.
Yeah.
The curse
so
of
Master
oil,
Young
the curse of silver.
is absolutely right in the sense because the Spaniards had real money, they didn't bother to create sophisticated systems of credit and transfer and so on. Whereas those people who didn't have real money had to make up money, and that allows you this fictitious
monopoly money
source, monopoly money, to
see, your boy was right.
drives innovation.
And I suppose the other funny thing about it is how bizarre and stupid the sort of asset bubbles of the past look in retrospect to historians. And you could almost hear Neil Ferguson writing the sort of chapter in some future book where he dissects how ill-advised, at the very least, our present problems' causes were.
Well, one of the things, I mean, I started reading history books at the age of 7 or 8. I love it. I read it at university. I read it all the time. But a lot of this stuff, by a clever historian, told me things I didn't know. He once wrote, Ferguson wrote a history of the Rothchilds. It must have been a lucrative enterprise since he wrote it for the family. But he tells you about how the Battle of Waterloo was really won by the Rothschilds because the British had credit and gold and fun. And the Rothschild does a deal. He gets gold bullion to Spain, primitive country, as Ed said a minute ago, because Wellington is fighting in Spain against the French, and the Spaniards need cash. They don't go in for this paper money. And Rothschild knows how to do it because he's a smuggler. And they say, it's a very reliable man, Mr. Rothschild.
And they create a banking network. And in fact, he comes back to the story in this book, because the end point of the Waterloo story is, of course, they then find out the result of the Battle of Waterloo, and they get the news back to London more quickly than the official messengers, and therefore make a financial killing.
Only because
back of it.
He'd bought a lot of gold. He thought the war would go on much longer. He gets the news of Waterloo 2 days before the government does, because he's a Rothschild. He thinks, what am I going to do with all this gold? The price is bound to fall. I'll buy government bonds, because peace means the value of government stock will go up. And he gets away with it, and he makes 600 million, which is proper money in 1815.
Absolutely, yeah. And I suppose the other thing that comes out of it is that nobody loves a banker. And almost the more successful they are, the more hated they become. And there's the flip side of that is that when things go wrong, they get the blame as well.
Yes, there is an element of that. I think much more what comes out of it is that the world can't function without banks, and if you're running the banks, you're running the world.
It's like sewage, you've got to have it.
Exactly, but these people are, you know, they're in charge, just as Michael was saying about the Rothschilds, and just as we, you know, all you remember from Florence to the Medicis. These are the powerful families, and they build networks across Europe and so on, and the same thing happens in America. And it's the people who create the banks and who understand finance who really have the real power. And I think that is an important message that comes out of this book.
But today, people, I mean, when people say bankers, that's kind of a generic term for anybody who's kind of really high up in the financial sector, isn't it? It's not sort of specific.
Cockney rhyming slang.
Yeah, well, I wasn't going to say it.
Well, let's not go there.